Welcome, everybody. This is Virtual and Immersive Hollywood. We are going to probably come up with what that means as we go through this. I'm John Canning, your moderator and host for today. I'm the executive producer at Digital Domain, responsible for things that aren't film, television, or commercials, but all that other kind of stuff. Good news is our guests today fall into that same kind of vein of all that other cool stuff that nobody else knows what to do with. I'm going to let them introduce themselves because they're far better at it than I am. And I'm going to start with the indomitable Lindsay Townley. Lindsay, hello.
Thanks, John. Lindsay Townley from Universal Pictures Creative Technologies. Do a lot of what John said. So a lot of production of new media content, virtual reality, augmented reality, some podcast immersive audio type content, short form, and a lot of game engine content these days. And I'll pass it to Ted.
Thanks, Lindsay. This is three of my favorite people on planet Earth that are all involved in the other, as we say, the other forms of entertainment in all of their forms. We spend a lot of time together in various ways in the real world. And of course, this past year in the alternate universe, where Eric and I had a little Zoom street fight yesterday. You could see, I'll tell you the story about it later. But my name is Ted. I'm the futurist at Paramount Pictures, which is part of the larger media organization called Viacom CBS. And I am responsible for looking out for what is around the next few corners as it relates to entertainment and technology and everything associated with things that are a bit unusual, a bit off the beaten path, that start to find their way into the mainstream worlds of entertainment over fairly lengthy periods of time. So my world is always looking a number of years out into the future and exploring and experimenting with technology and technology partners and creative groups that have enough of a bold enough stance that they're willing to work on things that have no immediate understanding of how they play yet into the world of entertainment. So I'm looking a little further out than most people are.
Perfect. And last but not least, and somewhat battered, Eric Shamlin.
On the mend. Thanks, John. Eric Shamlin, I'm EVP Entertainment at Media Months. We're a global production company. In my role, I kind of wear two hats. One of the fun things is I do play kind of in the traditional realm of creative and content development, IP development, but really the more active conversations and the other stuff is where I feel like I have the most fun. It's, all the fun acronyms: XR, AR, VR, ML, AI, all those. 5G is one that comes up quite a bit now, and how that's going to power the next wave of consumer entertainment. And so just being able to kind of play in both worlds, the other, and then I guess you would call the traditional world, has been something that's been really kind of a blessing in my career the last few years.
Fantastic. And thanks for everybody for joining us. I teed this up with the speakers today as we've all spent the last year going through slightly different things than we expected at the beginning of last year. But what I thought I would start off with is what is, we're I wouldn't say out of the pandemic, but we're certainly have weathered the big storm and moving on to the next phase. But pick one thing that now, as you look back over the last year and a half, that you're like impressed and amazed by, and then one thing that you're looking forward to. But let's first start with one of the things, or even one or two of them. What is one of those things that like you didn't see that coming, but now you're here and you're like, all right, that's interesting. And Eric, why don't we start with you?
Oh, wow. One of the things that I was surprised by, I guess, I don't know if it's a surprise more than I was more relieved, in that it was a bit of a watershed year for VR, I think, in that more headsets have been sold in the past year than kind of ever before. I mean, cumulatively, the Oculus Quest 2 has outsold that. So that becomes kind of a corner we've now turned, in that it's gaining momentum. And so a lot of the conversations I'm having are, what is that now? A lot of people that sort of ignored it over the last few years are now suddenly taking interest, because I don't know if you drive around the streets of LA, there's actually Oculus Quest headset billboards everywhere now. It's actually quasi going mainstream. And so I think that was a direct sort of knock-on effect of COVID. And then I think the other thing was sort of the rapid evolution of remote event storytelling, I guess for a lack of a better description. So we're all on Zooms. I think a year ago, we were all trying to figure out how to do Zooms and how to do events via Zoom, so to say. And I think a lot of us had sort of these stumbling starts of creating these events, but they were really kind of dry. They were frankly boring Zoom calls. And so we figured out, rather obviously, I think, that they had to be shows too. You had to produce them. You had to treat them as kind of pieces of content in and of themselves, scripted, run of show. What's the climax? Where's the breaks? You had to like treat these things as pieces of forms of content themselves, a little bit of showmanship. And so I think this art form, again, for lack of a better term, has progressed considerably. And now that we're going back to more physical events or whatever, you're going to have this hybrid world where the bar is much higher now in terms of like the showmanship for these kinds of events. So that, again, I'm not sure about surprising, but I think that was a really interesting twist this year.
No, I think it's one of those things, as you say, is like people are looking at you going, well, if you could do it during a pandemic, sure as heck should be able to do it, normal circumstances. So how about you, Lindsay?
Yeah, I think something that I was pleasantly surprised by was the increased adoption of virtual production workflows and software at the beginning of the pandemic, because of course, as a creative technology group, we help make the things, but we also educate our executives and the studio around us on what these new technologies can do. And it used to be more of a solution looking for a problem, but when the pandemic hit, and productions were shutting down, it was then an immediate solution to a dire problem that we had. So the uptick in demand for virtual production workflows was awesome. It made our jobs a lot easier. Less selling of virtual production technologies and more doing. And I think another thing that was interesting was the increased demand for animation. I think live action was really hurting, obviously, because you couldn't go on sets, and all sets were shut down for a long time. But a lot of animation houses were still up and running, if not at full capacity, close to full capacity, and sometimes, better than they were before. So I think I'm excited by the future of animation and how that came about through the pandemic.
Made it suddenly front and center, and they were like, oh, we can do animation. That's the one thing we can actually create right now.
Exactly.
How about you, Ted?
Well, before I answer, I'll take a cue off Lindsay and mention and do a shout out to some friends of mine in Ireland from a company called Cartoon Saloon that produced a fabulous piece of animated content. I see you putting your hand over your heart there, called Wolfwalkers. And it was just an immense treasure of beautifully crafted classic animation that they spent the kind of time that used to be only the purvey of Disney, and that group would attempt something of that level of artistry. And it became quite a nice hit for Apple TV, and it was very well received and won some awards. And so just a nice little mention there on, I agree with you that animation had a resurgence this year, and they were part of that. So it was lovely. They're a fantastic group out of Ireland that I mentor one of the younger folks in the group there. And we spend some time every week talking about really interesting things. To your question, John, I would say that maybe the most surprising thing, and you and I spend a lot of time together, so we are very often not surprised at things that happen because it's our job not to be surprised, that we often watch and see what those potential surprises for everybody else are, put a lot of time and energy in it. But I think more than anything, I would say the resiliency of the human condition and how apt they were to adapt to a level of technology prowess and technology use that I think many people of many sectors of many industries would have never thought that they could be this tech forward, that they could spend this many hours on video chat, this many hours with remote communication, this many hours learning new tools and new ways of doing the things they have to do every day, when a new forcing agent comes upon them, which is obviously an awful forcing agent that we have to reflect on in many ways and will, historically as we move forward. But there are many, many silver linings that have come out of the idea of things that folks like us on this panel were already very involved in. So oddly enough, my day-to-day life changed very little other than the places I would do it. I was doing the same things. I was doing remote communication like I always did. I always did a lot of video chats. I was always on talks and sometimes double booked. So if I was in China and there was another one in Argentina, like, well, I can't be there in person, but I'm happy to do it by video. I was very comfortable with that. And then what I discovered is over this past now year and a half, everybody got really comfortable with this idea of what we were already quite comfortable with. And what we see now moving forward, as many, many industries start to discuss this openly, is what is the new version of their pleasant comfort day-to-day work life where they can enjoy some of the fruits of being home, especially if you've got a family at home and you've got a place to be that's comfortable, and certain times where you want to be in a collaborative environment in person with others. A lot of us work at movie studios, so that's a wonderful, creative, collaborative environment. But we don't need to be there all the time, and we don't need to be there necessarily to do video chats or sit and type on a computer, or in our case, wear VR and AR headsets and experiment with things. We can do that from many other places. So the many other places world of planet Earth as a place to be productive, I think is maybe a surprise to a lot of people. A little less of a surprise for me, but certainly surprising at how many people at how many age ranges and use cases became adopters of new technology.
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic point, Ted. And we talked about this is we see these things. What it's interesting is, a lot of us will find ourselves in, trying to desperately explain to other people what we do or why we're trying to achieve a certain, something, or, you find yourself trying to explain to the IT department why you're doing something strange and unnatural. And it accelerated and brought a lot of people along for the ride. Suddenly they're like, oh, I get it. It's like, oh, now I understand what a distributed workflow is because we have to do one.
Right, right.
And I think, Lindsay, you mentioned virtual production, which I always laugh because somebody will say, let's talk about virtual production. I go, what is your version of virtual production? Right. I mean, some of these things, my studio, I would talk about people virtual production because I had a remote video village for a mocap shoot suddenly, right? It's like, now I don't have 30 people from the client and agencies all coming. They got to be remote. An aspect of virtual production. The rise and the craze of let's put everything on an LED wall. Wait, how well, the virtual scouting, like we're not going to send everybody to that location because we can't. So, let's just unpack virtual production for a second. And I think the interesting thing is, Eric, you've got, we have some studio world here and we have agency brand world that has to deal with this. And I know you did some amazing stuff with sports. So let's dive into a little more of this virtual production thing. Like what kind of worked or what is still a work in progress, right?
Well,
Lindsay, you want to tackle that one?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm a little biased because my background is in animation. So in my mind, virtual production a few years ago was, hey guys, let's just make the live action pipeline more like the animation pipeline. The fix it in pre, get a previs or an animatic up front and then stick to that throughout, the whole production, which live action changes, a lot down the whole line. So really adapting this fix it in pre mentality, I think for me is a lot of what virtual production is. It's not just the LED walls and the 3D, game engines that we're working in. It's really bringing together these departments that weren't necessarily working together yet and getting them to work together a lot sooner in the pipeline, rather than pushing it off to post and having to make decisions back there, which does make your pre-production take a lot longer and it's more expensive than previously, or can be. But it really saves you a lot of money down the line.
Yeah, I think it's not necessarily, it makes one part, it's shifting the budget around, right? It's, some people like, oh my God, some of these techniques will just save us a ton of money. Not necessarily, but they're making people, and I think that's the constant mantra that I have with people is you've got to now start thinking more aggressively on how your budget is arranged and when the money is flowing, because you are going to be front loading more of this, which again isn't necessarily a bad thing. Of doing a bit more planning up front. Um, you know, how about Ted?
Well, John, I'll say something that may be a little diplomatically disruptive here and spark some conversation. But when the worlds of virtual production in all flavors and forms comes up in discussion, my mind immediately goes to much ado about nothing, or maybe much ado about everything. And this is kind of what I mean by that. So as you know, and Eric knows well, I like to sort of put things in historical perspective, right? That's how I tend to inform the future, as I just look backwards. So when there's so much buzz and discussion about how amazing this newfangled thing is called virtual production, I would scratch my head going, well, this is just process photography. And we've always done process photography in some fashion in the motion picture business, going all the way back to George Millay and Man on the Moon, and Harry Harrison, his last name I'm finding hard to pronounce, but the guy who did the claymation stuff for the original King Kong. And, the idea of layering layers of motion picture film and putting front and back together and gluing them together in some fashion is not new in any way, shape, or form. Hitchcock, we could have many, many examples of the way he used process photography. And in the current world, we use what we call translights all the time to create cityscapes that look, and the DPs are so good at how they can light a translight now with like the understanding of what people expect out of cinematography, that the background should be slightly overexposed to the point where it feels real to our eyes because that's what we're used to. These are all just flavors of the same thing. And what we're really talking about is just some newfangled technology approaches to using different tool sets to do what Hitchcock did and what every other filmmaker did many, many times over in various ways. So, like I said, much ado about everything. None of this is new. I was like, why does everybody think this is new? All we're doing is basically taking new technology that we have more access to and is more accessible and more ubiquitous, and applying the same age-old techniques of the way we shoot car process photography and other things, when a lot of cinematographers and directors and producers don't really love even the best of green screen, because the fall off dynamics, unless you're going to put really, really high end VFX work on it, tend to always have a little cutouty look. And if you can do that in real time, number one, your actors get the feeling like they're actually in the environment. And like to Lindsay's point, as long as you prep it in advance and have the backgrounds at the proper way out of focus and whatever you want, you're basically just doing modern process photography. And the advantages of doing it on a giant LED wall is it's a flexible dynamic translight that you connect into a game engine, and you don't have to hang another translight, like it's not a physical gigantic poster. It's just a giant television that you can feed any sort of background into it. Where it gets really interesting and exotic is you actually start experimenting with volumetric photography that has three-dimensional aspects to it, and what we can do photorealistically in a game engine, so that you actually get 3D depth cues like you would if you were actually on location, but pumping that through a game engine. And I work with a lot of the technology groups that are really, pushing that forward, including Digital Domain, which is a big pioneer of that where you work. So I don't know if that helps the conversation, or maybe if this was on a chat, people would be like, well, he's wrong in many ways, but I just think it's been around for such a long time that it's, not really new.
No, and I do wish we had a live audience, because boy, I'd love to get them all whipped up, and then but Ted, you and I say the same thing. You say it usually better than I do, but it's new tools to do some of the things we've done, and I think what we saw during the pandemic was suddenly a bunch of people rushing into the space thinking this is brand new and we've never done this before, and it's like, no, well, we have some new tools, and one of the silver linings is that acceleration of some things that we needed to go. The fail fast methodology happened quickly, where we're like, let's try this. Nope, doesn't work. Let's try this. Nope, doesn't work. Let's try this. Oh, that's not so bad. But yeah, I think that's the interesting thing is a lot of this aspect of virtual production that people are thinking is a brand new craze is things we're adding new tech to and
Right.
trying out new techniques. But it's forcing a broader group of people to think about that prepping earlier. Because they'll start go, what are we going to put on the screen? Which department do you call? The fact that now the transition between a night scene and a day scene can happen at a
Or you
click of a
can
button.
live with that night scene at Magic Hour for 12 hours,
Mhm.
which
Right.
we could do statically with a giant poster years ago, but now we can do it dynamically, and we can actually make the sunset over and over and over again to capture the 12 angles the director wants, right?
Yeah.
And I think there's also like unexpected little moments that certainly hit me and probably hit you all as well. One of the unique things about it is that you can turn that giant television, that giant LED wall, into a green screen and make it a traveling green screen at any size you want. So the cost of hanging huge amounts of green muslin all across a soundstage is still significant. But if you have an LED wall up and the VFX folks are like, well, we didn't finish the spacecraft quite in time, so we'll just comp that in later. Well, if you're already shooting stuff in an LED wall, you don't have to hang a bunch of green on the other side of the set. You can just turn the LED wall green or just a section of it green, and then the camera can track where the green spot is. So even if you had like the low res out of focus stuff of say the forest or the science fiction planet, whatever it was, and you didn't have the high res backgrounds for the main key actors, you could just put the low res stuff on the side so they get the right lighting, and then you could stick a green area in, and wherever the actors walked, it would just track the green, and then they could comp that in later. That is a newfangled approach to an age-old problem of like, we do a lot of green screen and blue screen work, and now we can apply a technology layer to that as well. That was some of the unexpected sort of moments for me of how good that worked.
Yeah, it's the necessity mother of invention sort of thing. Eric, I know in your side of the business, you've gone through some interesting moments and challenging production and learning a few things. What has come out of your side?
I feel like I've got so many thoughts, and I don't want to leave Ted's point unaddressed, because I feel like it brings up a really important one, and that it's nothing new under the sun, so to say. And the thing I'm seeing is this myth of democratization, I tend to call it, and that it's democratized virtual production. In a sense, it has. Anybody with Unreal and an LED wall can, in theory, do it. But what it's really done is exploded the toolkit. Like, it's just made the toolkit way bigger, way more comprehensive, and therefore the skills or the specialization of skills has just become that more demanding or exacting. And so in one way, it has democratized sort of production, because everybody can now shoot on the moon, so to say. But to make the moon look good is a rarefied art form. And so I always find I get in that sort of conversation where people are like, oh, what do you think it's going to do for the YouTubers or the DIY filmmakers? I'm like, probably not a whole lot, to be honest, at least not initially. I think the skill set just becomes that more exacting, and is kind of where I see this, which I think is a good thing for the industry and people, and sort of pushing the boundaries. The boundary just keeps moving forward, right?
Yeah.
You never reach the boundary, and so. Go ahead.
I mean, to your point on YouTubers, right? Like, there's levels of production where people are doing comped green screen in their home. I've got a blurred background now, and it's just now the tool sets are getting more refined, the concepts of playing with that, but it's still, there's a level of production and expertise and talent that you can see a really good job version of that and an okay job version of that, a good comp job, an okay comp job, but it's starting to open up some of the realm of tools and possibilities. You mentioned VR, and you were like, hey, VR did something different than we thought it would. I think we all rushed into we were all headed in the beginning of last year going, okay, location-based experiences is going to be awesome. Whoops. But what were you thinking when you said VR took off? Because I think I agree with you. And there's a whole sector that has taken off in interesting ways that people didn't necessarily expect. And what were you thinking? Like, what areas are you thinking?
I mean, I do want to couch it in that while I think it's been a watershed year and it's larger than it ever has been, it's still fairly early days. So I do want to couch that, but the signals are all in the right direction is probably the best way to put it in terms of adoption, toolkit, even the language around it and how we describe these experiences or consume these experiences, I think has evolved tremendously really over the last year, maybe a couple of years. I think what we're seeing, and I just had a big call today with a major technology company wanting to use VR for virtual conference rooms, enterprise use cases, basically, there was a lot of, I think, sort of grassroots bootstrap startups 3 years ago trying to get into that space, but it was a little too early. The headsets weren't quite there, whatever, but I think that's changing very rapidly. The headset is there now. There is definitely a tool, tool to lean on. And so I think a lot of those companies are now going to have kind of their day in the sun. We're seeing that across the board. We're seeing, brands again take notice. A lot of major apparel or lifestyle brands, they used to not care, frankly, about VR because it's not in front of enough people. It's not cool enough. It's kind of got a like awkward kind of nerd appeal to it. But that sheen or that connotation has worn off in large measure. And so you're seeing some of the kind of sexier, cooler lifestyle brands now go, oh, what is this VR thing? How do we get in there? And I think there's several reasons for that. I think the headset adoption has been way better than expected over the last year. But I also think Facebook and the various other groups are making some smart bets in terms of like promotion around it. And I know this year they're going big with Horizon, which has been sort of slow baked for the last couple of years. Those of you that may not be aware, Horizon is sort of Facebook's attempt at the metaverse. Ready Player One, The Matrix, a la with a much more sort of kiddie, family friendly
Pastels,
yes, veneer. But nonetheless, it is a large bet on kind of the virtual world. And they're going big with it this year, trying to bring in brands and IP just to make sure it's a real thing and lands and gets the eyeballs it needs. And so I just think those are all, again, signals moving in the right direction for those of us that were kind of early into that game over the last 6 or so years.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Ted, I'm sure you have some thoughts on this.
I do, unfortunately or fortunately, for those that have heard me gab about this ad nauseum many times. But the story is always altering and changing, right? And there are always like new little hotspots that are important to the forward trajectory of new screens that work in new ways than what we refer to as traditional screens, which we're all looking at on right now, although we could certainly easily do this in many tools in VR today. There's lots of social collaborative tools that we're using on a pretty regular basis in our world now. I think like some important touch points, and it's well documented through a lot of the news sources. The levels of truth maybe differ, but when you look at a company like Facebook that arguably is the biggest all-in this belief structure that this is going to be an agent of significant change for their business and many other businesses, at this point in time, what we think we know is that they lose money on every headset they sell, on every Quest that they sell. So it's a business with a long range bet. And that to me is a key success point when there is one or more entrants in the market that are willing to say that the future opportunities of this are so large in whatever form factor and evolution it takes over time that we are willing to take a loss on it, a significant loss on it for an extended period of time until we cultivate it and own our piece of real estate that is bigger than anyone else's piece of real estate. It's a pretty bold move for a company like Facebook to do that, right? And they'll talk about their success points with certain software and the companies they acquired, but at the end of the day, it's an end sum loss for a long time until they gain massive upside when the real next change happens. The other thing that's maybe significant from a news perspective is fairly recently they talked pretty openly about the fact that 10% of their workforce at Facebook is now dedicated to some sort of virtual reality or mixed reality task, which is 8, 9, maybe 10,000 human beings, high level, Silicon Valley salaries. That's a major commitment for a company when the overall market share and size is teeny tiny compared to what we refer to as the traditional media opportunities, of which social media on a traditional screen, a smartphone, a laptop, a a tablet is much, much larger, right? And that's where they make all their revenue. But they're a huge company in terms of market cap. So they have the ability to stretch something out, and they keep trying and they keep working on stuff until they feel like they've got the right chemistry. So that's one piece of the puzzle. I think, HTC and Vive with their first plays in the market and their collaboration with Valve and Steam, and then that sort of went a little south, but they're not giving up either, and they're moving upstream, right? To Eric's point of the industrial use cases, the companies that want to do something in when we all get back out in public, which is happening now on a more rapid basis. They don't want to use the consumer level, even though I wouldn't say that's low end at all now, but they want something more specialized and more exotic. So now these 5K headsets that HTC are releasing that require, graphics power to run them and so forth and so on, start to segment the market and start to separate the use cases. And I also think that's really good for a robust marketplace, right? Where you've got so many use cases of these types of devices that it is not a one size fits all device that's going to touch this. And I think as we move forward into the mixed reality devices that start to look a little more like eyeglasses or some sort of visory thing, there's a misconception that I think a lot of these companies are working on, that they have to try and make one that solves like every category's problem. But the truth of the matter is, just like we have lots of different screens in our life that have all different kinds of purposes, we use smartphones for things, we use laptops for things, we use giant computer screens, which we call televisions these days for certain types of things, and lots of other things, right? And we use VR screens, those of us in this type of business, for other use cases that can cross over into those more traditional use cases. But when it comes to the mixed reality one, we're still at a stage where people are like, well, how does it do all this stuff? And to me, the true real answer underneath is that just like you have 6 or 7 screens in your life today, you're going to have 6 or 7 mixed reality type devices over the next 10 or 15 years that will cover your work needs, your industrial needs, your home entertainment needs, your social media needs. And there'll be some crossover, but there'll likely be different form factors and different use cases for different things. And I think that's not talked about enough in terms of where the market success traction is going to happen. But I also want to dull everybody's senses a little bit and let them know this is not like next year's problem. This is a 10+ year journey from even where we sit today, and really a 25+ year journey from when we started in this arena of understanding that these kinds of screen devices would become mainstream at some point. And I think we're starting to see the earliest stages of mainstreaming right now with what PlayStation is going to announce, and come out with their next thing, and what Oculus is coming out with on the Facebook side. We're mainstreaming. We're starting to get consumer adoption, not just like super geeks and nerds like us doing it. People are buying these things. And like Eric said, there are posters and, right next to other traditional advertising saying, go buy your Quest for $300 and play these games and enjoy these experiences. But this road is long, winding, and with lots of trenches and trouble spots along the way to get us to where it's just as used as traditional, what we call traditional compute tools today. So I just want to let everybody know you're in for a long ride.
Yeah,
which is kind of where Facebook sees it too. It's a long
ride.
It's
buckle up, because there's going to be the cul-de-sacs. And to your point, Ted, there's, if you look at the business model of an Xbox or Sony PlayStation, right? And that same sort of, subsidize the heck out of the hardware because you got to build that market. And, you look at those at this point, and you could say, okay, Facebook's taken a page out of that book.
Absolutely.
The enterprise aspect of this to me has really gotten the shot in the arm. The companies that I know that are working on skills retraining, the soft skills work, and in headset. And, there's companies that are PricewaterhouseCoopers, Walmart, the enterprise side of this, and that drives the sort of innovation and money to then go into that broader consumer marketplace and continue and to try things out. And I've always said, right now, VRs can be in that purpose-driven moment where if I got to put the headset on, or I need to put on the headset, I'm going to put up with bad ergonomics or okay, because I'm solving a problem. And then we start to iterate and we start to move. Lindsay, I know you've been, flogging your way through this, and you were doing the location-based stuff over at Universal, and then went, whoops, well, okay, we're not going out there now. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's we're all competing for, someone's time and attention in entertainment. It's, does someone want to watch a film, or do they want to turn on Netflix, or do they want to, play Pokemon Go outside? What's the form of entertainment that someone wants to do? And, we're not just film and television studios anymore. We're IP studios, and we're entertainment companies that are doing more than just film and television. And it's really interesting. Ted, you bring up a ton of good points. And interestingly, I think there will be a shift of, what devices people will be using. We saw it last year with mobile when Quibi was launching. We thought everyone was going to be on their phones in the subways, watching Quibi, but then we heard there was this huge Switch explosion, and you couldn't find a Nintendo Switch to save your life. I had to buy one secondhand off of a friend just to play Animal Crossing, and I'm not, I play games, but not a traditional gamer. Played a bunch of Beat Saber during 2020, but it was really these social experiences that we were all craving. Was, all right, we're all stuck in the house. I want to hang out with my friends. Where can I go in the virtual world to hang out with my friends? And, there were console and PC games like Fall Guy and, the Jackbox games suite, which brought all your friends together. And it's like, would you rather watch a film or a TV show, or would you rather, get on Jackbox games with your friends? And maybe it's all of them, and you do a Netflix party later. So it's, I take a step back now when I think about VR. I just kind of look at the whole ecosystem and, what is the content. But I also like Ted's point about the AR glasses, or the mixed reality glasses, and the enterprise future that we're going towards. I think a lot of that has to do with audio. And we were all talking before about audio. Podcasts and audiobooks have really been taking a bigger role, I think, in entertainment versus the past couple of years. And it's interesting to see folks like Spotify and, Apple Music get into interesting forms of audio entertainment. And I think that's going to be a huge part of what, smart glasses might involve.
Might look like. Yeah. I also think, Lindsay, like hits like Among Us, that is very much an output of pandemic culture, as it were, and kind of took the world by storm through a YouTube influencer that was like, you got to try this game. The graphics are lousy, but the experience is fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
And you cannot have a conversation these days without talking about the success of Roblox and UGC game creation for that segmented market that's growing, as it grows. And of course, the massive economic success of Fortnite as a free-to-play game that ain't so free for your kids and your grandkids and your cousins and nieces and nephews that are all about skinning up and leveling up. The economics of to your point, entertainment and IP, much broader than what we've defined by let's stick some pixels up on a screen and put them in a rectangle and call that entertainment. The startup mentality around so many companies that have profited so mightily, both creatively and economically, from looking outside of the norms of what we would consider entertainment a generation or even a half a generation ago, and started to experiment and play, and see that play turn into massive success, is a very telling sign for all of us that work for very large media organizations. And it's an important thing for us to continue to inform the folks that we work with that are so responsible for the here and now and have so many day-to-day challenges of keeping a company successful and alive with the offerings they have currently. But if you forget for a minute that you need to have people and resources dedicated to what's around the next few corners and how do we get ahead of it, you're definitely not going to be on the right side of history. So I'm lucky enough to have really refined support, and I know you do as well. And so does Eric at Media Monks, which is growing like a weed because of all this type work that he's doing. That people get this, and while they may not know how to act like a startup, they're at least trying to act like a startup, and to me that's good enough. Like we'll get there as long as they have the mentality and the wherewithal to say, we understand things are changing around us. The sand is changing underfoot, and we at least need to play a part in figuring this out. It broadly informs this thing that John, maybe Eric, you mentioned the word, the metaverse, right? And
Yeah.
we're all in it right now. We've been in it all year in some fashion. This kind of video chat metaphor is a part of the metaverse. It doesn't exist in reality. It only exists on pixels on screen. And it expands and takes all kinds of touch points, which is of course why all this heat around NFT and stuff like Decentraland and all these things, the advent of, again, look at it from historical perspective, right? Second Life and Star Citizen and The Sims, and none of this is new, right? Much ado about everything. It's all just evolving the way the human condition has figured out how to connect with each other.
I feel like we're circling kind of a topic that I think Ted and I have had many conversations. I feel like there's a generational aspect to this that we've not always admitted to. And I always have to point out that the Kickstarter that kind of started this arms race was 8 years ago now.
Yep.
We're still not at the holodeck. Everybody thought we were going to have the holodeck in 3 years or 5 years. And I always like to highlight the fact that Michael Abresh, the chief science officer at Oculus, gave this speech years ago. You plot Moore's law. You know what the processing powers of the LEDs are. You know what the battery lives are. You know what the CPU is. All that to take the metaverse. You can plot that using Moore's law, and that's a 30-year plan.
Curve or cycle.
Curve.
Yeah. I mean, and you're not wrong. And the funny part is that it's funny. You said it, Ted. Earlier, it was like, Lindsay, is that a real background or
Yeah.
yeah. And if you think about it,
nice. Yeah.
but A, Lindsay has a lovely background that is her real background. But B, it is that sort of blending of these realities. And how many people have seen the filters that people are applying to themselves? Or I've adjusted the color. I don't look this tan all the time. It's these things. It's the subtleties of this mixing and matching where people are starting to go, oh, I get it, existing in a common environment. It's the fact that suddenly there's a whole group of people that thought that people that played massively multiplayer games and as a character as those gamer people over there suddenly found themselves, oh wait, I'm online with a group of people working through this. Like it's not as strange as you think it is.
I think that's the other aspect of this sort of like generational thing. There's been actually kind of a ground like education happening that we have to credit like Snap and some of these other companies for that. Kids are using augmented reality every day now, right? But they don't use the term. They don't use the nerd terms, right? They just say, hey, isn't it cool? I look like a kitten today. they just completely like get around the sort of the baggage, the language. And it just becomes part of their lives. Everything needs to be interactive and immersive. And I feel like you're seeing that cultural trend using the lenses and whatnot with sort of a maturation of the actual technologies, right? And so in the next 10 years, it's all gonna like dovetail really nicely, I think.
It goes back to that theory around that technology ceases to exist once it becomes ubiquitous and you don't recognize it as technology, right? And that's what you're talking about, Eric, is that moment where we don't think about it. It's like, the augmented reality that we use in television every day to put a yellow line on football or whatever. We've been using mixed reality, augmented reality for a long time in a particular area. We don't think about it that way. It's just a part of that storytelling. Yeah. And the kids, but those generations where it's just what they do, they don't think about it as the technology trappings. We may talk about it in conferences and things like that, but when it just starts becoming a part of your everyday life and the way you communicate and the way you relate to people.
Yeah. I think there's something you mentioned, Eric, that I think is really important when you talked about we still haven't gotten to the holodeck, right? We keep attempting, we keep chewing at that monster, and we keep working on the edges. But I think what's also really interesting is that when you look at broadly entertainment and entertainment creators, they continue to inform us creatively about the fact that this is going to come. It just struck me when you were talking about it. There's a show that I've become pretty passionate about that Paramount TV produces for HBO Max, which is one of those interesting things about the entertainment industry where we're all cross-pollinate, as Lindsay knows. We all work with each other and for each other. And it's a show called Made for Love, which I don't know if you've caught it yet, but they are very much about creating the illusion of their version of the holodeck inside this thing that they call the hub. It's a very twisted, kind of like, Breaking Bad meets Star Trek sort of experience. Like, it's a wild, wild show. But it's a wonderful journey into a pseudo kind of future. There's a bit of like a Silicon Valley comedy vibe to it as well. It's raucous and bonkers, and the cast is amazing. It's the young woman director, young woman showrunner, fantastic show. And they have modernly informed us a different version of what we see in the Star Trek idea of the holodeck. This is another version of that they just keep putting out there, which forces all of us on the technology side to try and make it real. Because if it's in TV shows and movies, we have an impetus and almost a technology responsibility to continue to try and live up to that fantasy, that belief that these creative people that are making things want to happen. And it's an important part of like how we've defined everything in technology. Or very, like, it's hard to find a thing that has become part of our mainstream technology world that didn't come from some creative ideation in a TV show or a movie. And obviously Star Trek is, the perfect example of that, because we're all on the view screen right now, screen up and here we go. And that was defined many, many generations ago, well before we could have screens that looked like what was in Star Trek. And now we have that. It's real. So the next thing is definitely coming. It just takes a while to get to the level of sophistication that showrunners want today.
And it's going to go in those couple of different directions. It's going to be, the holodecks are going to be your holodeck is going to be different than my holodeck, so to speak. As we wrap up here, we're coming to the end of our hour. So we're looking forward, we're marching into the new year, so to speak. We're well into it, but we're coming out of a pandemic and we're going into a new normal, if you will. So if each one of you has a thought of what you're hopeful for, what you're looking forward to in the next 6 months before we probably get together and talk about this kind of stuff again. But what are you excited about coming up? Eric?
I think over the next, and we're already seeing it with a lot of the conversations we're having really in the just past couple of weeks. I think everybody's excited to get to the new normal post-COVID. I think you're going to see a Q4, sort of knock on wood, kind of a return to normalcy in a sense, but it's going to be a new normal in that all the things we've just talked about are going to impact the world moving forward. I don't think there's now a separation in the sort of virtual and physical anymore. I think at least in the entertainment and broader sort of brand and communications world, every event from now on is going to be hybridized. And I think now that we do return to the physical, there's going to be a renewed interest or awareness of how impactful and how meaningful these virtual experiences can be. And so, yeah, I'm waiting for that, to be honest. And the conversations right now are very promising. I think a lot of the big brands, big IP, they're looking to Q4 as kind of a return to the new normal, so to say.
Cool. Ted?
I like the term the new roaring 20s. I feel like we're getting tuned up for that. I feel like there is a lot of desire for people to get out of their bubbles and start to experience the socialization and the technology layers. Like I said at the beginning, we talked, have become so much more comfortable for people that they're going to find ways to put that together, to put their new puzzle together of their 2021 to 2030 experience that was very different than if there was no pandemic for a year and a half. They're much more informed about the things that technology can do to enhance their lives, to help their lifestyle, to help their entertainment choices, and to, take them to a joyous, happy place that maybe only people that really worked in the theme park business really knew, right? It wasn't sort of everybody, but now everybody sort of created their own version of their own sort of theme park style simulation world. And those of us that have VR devices floating around us all the time, we kind of get to live that world. It's starting to grow and become more ubiquitous. And I think the logical like next step is the return of an evolved version of out of the home entertainment, the return of the theatrical model for certain motion pictures where people are really ready to feel that moment again of like, let's go gather and let's go hang out because we can do that now, right? It's going to be safe and it's continued to be, worked on with lots of different, resources. And here we are. And I think the next 10 years are going to be a really interesting hybridization of the comfort of the metaverse and these new virtual worlds and okay, it's time to open the front door and get out there again. So I'm pretty excited about it for those of us that do that stuff for a living.
Yeah, I agree. All right, Lindsay, take us home. What's your thought?
I think I'm most excited about how this year has democratized a lot of, Eric, you used this word earlier, how it's democratized the tools and building content in our industry. There's this globalization that's kind of obviously happening on a huge scale, but it doesn't matter if you work in the UK or Australia or Los Angeles, New York, you can Zoom with studios and you can Zoom and, it's more about the quality of your work versus where you're working from. And I think the hybrid, some people working from home, some people going into the office is here to stay, that hybrid remote working workflow, which I'm excited about that because, it opens up a new talent pool to come and work in Hollywood versus people who have only live in Los Angeles or only live in New York. It's really opening up that talent pool and that inclusion. And game engine technology, there's huge demand for Unreal and Unity artists. So it's kind of like, if you know how to use one of those tools, you will get a job. So it's a great leveling of the playing field that I'm excited about.
Fun. No, I think you're all like bang on. It feels like it's more exciting than ever to be in this and to be working on these kind of technologies and content. And it feels like it's just exploding in the possibilities. So I think there's positive enthusiasm coming from all of us. On the behalf of Digital Hollywood, I'm John Canning. Thank you for joining us.